let's look at functions. I'm going to share a few functions with you today, and then we're going to play around with them just a little bit. But the function that we have already played around with is this one. It's the print function. I recognize that this screen is not readable to you, but what I wanted to show you was what it looks like in the function reference that you all have access to. And if you look up functions online, you will see very similar things. But we've got a description of the function, which tells you what it does. The syntax, which tells you kind of the rules of how to use this function. An example of that function being used, and what are called parameters. Parameters are the slots where you put arguments to the function. Arguments are additional information that you give to that function so it knows what to do. Now the print function, right? We've played around with this already. Print, there's the function, and then we gave it an argument, one argument of hello world. In print, you're allowed to give it more than one argument. I can set, if I put a comma, I can actually give it another thing. Another argument here, and it will print both of those things, right? Hello world, my name is Bill. If I want this on a separate line, I can give it its own print statement, because at each print statement, each print statement, you can't see this, but at each print statement starts a new line afterwards. So when I print this now, or when I run this now with the two print statements, those two things will be printed on separate lines. So the print function can take one or more, right? It says objects, one or more required. So the object I gave the print function as the parameter here is a string literal, but you can give it other things too, like a variable, okay? It has other optional arguments that you don't have to include, and if you leave them out, it will tell you what it will default to. Now, we're not going to get into the complexities of how to do all of this stuff with the print function today, but that is the print function. Another function that is useful to us is the type function. The type function will take an object that you give it as an argument, and it will tell you what type of object that is. Now, sometimes that's obvious and sometimes it's not. The interesting thing about type is this. Now, what type of object did I give it just now? A string, right? I gave it a string. So in theory, this type function should tell us that I have a string. So if I run this, what happened? It didn't do anything. I don't have an error. So it means it worked, but it didn't do anything. It actually did do something. Type is what we refer to as a return something function, okay? There are two basic types of functions, or two ways to interact with functions. Some functions do something. Print is a do something function. It prints something. Type is a return something function. So I give it an object and it sends back to Python, the Python interpreter, it sends back to the Python interpreter the answer to that question as a string. What type is this? It sends it back. Now, if I don't do anything with what it returns, it just goes away. It's sort of like playing catch with a football, but doing it by yourself. You throw the football and it just sort of like doesn't go anywhere, or it just goes and it hits the ground and nothing really happens. There's nothing to send it back to you. So when I have type, I either have to put the answer in a container, in a variable, or I have to do something with it, like print it out. So to make this code work, I can do this. Okay. Now, if I run this, it's still not going to show me anything, right? Because all it's doing is checking the type and putting it into this variable, but I haven't done anything with the variable. So it's a container, then the program ends, and when this program ends, whatever's in those containers and the containers themselves goes away. So if I want to find out what type it is, I have to do something. I have to use a do something function like print to print it out. So now you can see when I run that, type checks this and says it's a string, puts it in that variable, and then print says I'm going to print that out. And that's what we get. Class, it's a class. I told you it's a class or an object of the type string. So now I can use that to find out what type of variable I'm dealing with. So if I put an int in there, it'll say an int. If I put a float, if I put a Boolean, okay, it'll tell me. It knows what's in there. Now, there is a faster, shorter way to do this, and I'm going to show you how to do that. I don't really need this to be in a variable and then to print that variable out. I can actually do something called nesting. I can nest one function inside another, just like this. Now notice, for every left-hand parenthesis, there's a matching right-hand one. Left-hand, right-hand. Same on both sides. That's a common, I pointed out because it's a common error that people make when they're nesting functions. So nested function says and it always goes from the inside out. So I do type of this, and that, whatever the answer of this is, gets passed as the argument to print. So it just goes from the inside out. So it prints the type all in one line, does the same thing, less code. Simple is better, right? That's what we're trying to figure out. So we have do something functions and return something. There are functions that may do both, but there are many functions, especially the main Python functions, that just do one or the other. So it's just good to know, like, there are functions that return something, in which case you have to do something with that returned value. If it's a do something function, then you may not.